As I mentioned this morning, when Andy McAfee and I co-founded the Initiative on the Digital Economy, we have 4 major pillars that we have brought together under this umbrella. You heard this morning from Sinan and his team. Sandy just presented the amazing things they're doing in big data and data privacy. Next up, I want to introduce a set of people who are going to be telling you about the work we're doing in work and value in the digital economy. All 4 of these people are sort of young stars in the field. None of them have tenure quite yet, although one is about to, I think. And but they're all, I think, going to be the stars of the field in the coming years, the ones that you are shaping the field, and the research they're doing has been really quite fascinating. Let me start by introducing Christina McElheren, who I hope is here somewhere. Yes, right over here, good. And she's going to be talking about a project, Data in Action, looking at how data-driven decision-making is affecting organizations. It's a topic we've been thinking about a lot. Ironically, it's been held back a bit because we didn't have very good data on data-driven decision-making. And so we went ahead and we addressed that problem, and I think we've gone a long way towards solving it. I guess you can judge for yourselves how well we've done that. But as she'll tell you, we've got a very large data set of how companies are using data and how it's affecting their performance, what kinds of things it's complementary with. Christine is a professor at the University of Toronto. She was here in the Cambridge area at Harvard for a while, and she's a IDE fellow here. So please join me in welcoming Christina.
Great. Am I on? Oh, good. Wonderful. So I'm really excited to be here today and excited to show this really relatively new research that Eric and I have been working on. We are doing this sort of ongoing project. Eric started with Nick Bloom and John Van Reenen to raise a lot of money through NSF grants and work with Census to try to go after data. As Eric said, one of the key things holding us back from understanding how firms are actually bringing data to bear in decision-making and practices and changes in the organization is data on what they're doing. How do we see this? And so one thing you can do when you don't know the answer is to just go ask. And so what they did is paired up with Census, who does a lot of asking of firms about what's going on inside their firm, and added some really great questions about managerial practices and the use of data. So I have to put a little disclosure up there that because we are using the non-public firm level data, everything I'm going to show you has been rigorously checked to make sure no proprietary firm data leaks out. What we're trying to do with the first step here is start to unpack a bit this very basic question about what is the relationship between the collection and the use of data in firms and firm performance. And moving beyond that, some of the complementarities that could be important if you're going to do data-driven decision-making in firms, what other things have to be there for that to be effective. And given the interest in this room and some of the vocabulary, I want to make clear that this is not about big data. In fact, what we're going to be looking at is more big use of relatively tractable data. So this is about having not huge volumes of data, but actually moving from almost no data collection and use to something relatively intensive, but maybe not lots and lots of information about lots and lots of things. Of course, a key thing you have to start with is this question about what do you mean by data-driven decision-making? It's a term we kick around, but when you go to measure this, you have to boil it down to something relatively simple that people can grapple with. And what we did first was go talk to people who run firms and say, okay, what do you think about when you use data? What do you think about when you're in a meeting and you need data to bring to bear on something, when you're monitoring your plant operations or whatever? And my favorite was talking to this plant manager in Atlanta. And I have to be clear, this is through my personal network. It's not a Census connection. She said, managing the plant all starts with the data. It is the sheet of music we are all playing off of, which was very poetic and impossible to use for any kind of survey. So, what does that mean? So if we want to think about maybe a more manufacturing type thing, Peter Sondergaard has a quote on this that I like. Information is the oil of the 21st century, and analytics is the combustion engine. So this is going to get us somewhere. But we can't really ask firms about their newfangled music or their newfangled oil. That doesn't mean anything to them. So we had to really step back and say, how can we measure this? And what's difficult is that data-driven decision making is actually a multi-dimensional thing. There's a lot of different individual tests that come together about what data are we going to collect, how much are we going to invest in it, who gets to decide what data we're collecting, what are we going to do with it once we have it. It's sort of this multi-dimensional construct, and not all firms think about it the same way. So if we're going to put something on a survey that goes out to 50,000 establishments across all of the industries in the manufacturing sector, it's got to be something that makes sense to a lot of different firms. And then, how do we get the right dimensions of this in the right language? So fortunately, we got to lean on the professionals at the US Census Bureau who have huge teams of people who will take questions out in the field and do cognitive testing and get to something that we can do something with. To be clear, this is a very first step, but I'm going to show you what it is that we have to work with. So the data is coming from the annual survey of manufacturers. This goes out every year to a representative sample of 10% of the manufacturing plants in the US, and it's carefully constructed to poll firms from a whole lot of different industries, different size representations, and we get about 70% of the economy in the certainty sample. So they're overweighting towards large firms. And then added on to this annual survey was this new MOPS, which is the Management and Organizational Practices Survey. And if you're curious, you can find the survey instruments online, but it asks some really wonderful and novel questions about what the firm is doing for monitoring their activities, what sort of incentives are in place for workers in the firm, how organizational decision making is done, and of course, data-driven decision making, which we shorten to DDD because I can spend all my time just saying data-driven decision making over and over again. So a nice feature of the survey is that it was done about the state of affairs in 2010. The survey actually went out in 2011. But it asked what was the state of things not only in 2010, but thinking back 5 years. So we can see some change over time in these diverse firm environments and for a large number of firms. Now, for those of you who are dealing with huge, vast data sets for huge, vast numbers of customers, maybe this isn't like a wowing number, but for people in economics to get 34,000 establishments or 18,000 with complete data, this gives us the power to do something that we often just can't even begin to start to do in terms of controlling for a lot of other things that are going on in the firm. So we're kind of excited about the size of this data. Another thing we're excited about with this data is the very, very high response rate. A typical challenge when you're doing surveys is getting people to respond. The benefit of working with Census is your response is required by law. Now, it turns out if you don't fill it out, you don't get sent to jail, but you do get a big enough fine that it's probably worth your while to do this. And in fact, there's people checking your response, so if you file the wrong stuff, you get an even bigger fine. So we get an 80% response rate, very high quality data. And other people have to check it, which I'm excited about. So the questions that we leverage for this survey start at the beginning of the survey. The second question on the survey says, in 2005 and 2010, how many key performance indicators were monitored at this establishment? And it's just very high level, 1 to 2, 3 to 9, 10 or more, and it asks about things like production, cost, waste, quality, inventory, et cetera. This is important because it comes early in the survey and it sets up the respondent to think about the kinds of data collection that's relevant for operational performance in a plant, which is what we're ultimately going to be looking at. Then another question that we use comes a little bit later on target setting, and it asks what best describes the time frame of production targets at this establishment. We can think about short-term targets, long-term targets, or some combination thereof. This is important because it's one thing to collect data, but you have to know if the data is telling you good news or bad news. And without some sort of targets, you don't have a framework for decision making in the first place. And this turns out to be pretty useful. And from speaking with firms and managers, it's clear that having the right target for the right task is important. So having a nuanced mix of short and long-term targets is really more at the frontier of practice than, say, just having one or the other. So later in the survey are some very basic questions about, Question 27 is what best describes the availability of data to support decision making at this establishment. And then in question 28, it asks about the actual use. And we have the scale going from, it's not available to everything we need is available. Or we don't really use this data in decision making, or it relies almost entirely on decision making. More firms respond at the next to the top category. A lot of them are pretty humble about whether they have everything they need and whether they're doing it all the time. But it turns out in this data-driven age that plants are a little sanguine about how much data-driven decision making they're really doing. And so I put up there the estimated averages for what we could think about for the top 2 categories for data availability, the top 2 categories for data use, putting them together, layering in KPIs, and then our favorite definition here, which has all of them having multiple KPIs, nuanced target setting, and then both high availability and use of data. That's in the orange. And you can see how that moves over time. And a key takeaway is that a lot of firms think they're doing a lot of this until you ask them, how many things are you actually tracking? When we get to an objective measure, the diffusion of this practice goes down just a little bit. And so we're hoping we're capturing more of the frontier of this type of practice in the population of firms that we're studying. So an important question when we're thinking about the performance implications of this practice is who is adopting it. We are not seeing an exogenous treatment of data-driven decision-making on a random population of firms. Sinan did a great job reminding us we have to separate out correlation and causation here, and we have this fundamental issue that firms get to choose if they're going to do this. And so when we're thinking about performance, what we're able to measure here is what happens to the firms that self-select into this. It's worth taking a step back and saying, all right, so which firms actually go after this? And it's not surprising from the history of studies on information technology use in firms that the bigger firms do this first. That you can spread the cost across more employees. If you've got more IT capital in place in the first place, you're more likely to have data available and be investing in data and IT-related practices. If you have a better educated workforce, and we're measuring that by the percentage of bachelor's degrees in the managers and non-managerial employees at the plant, if they're doing more structured management in general. So what's nice about this survey is it asks a lot about a range of management practices. And one of our concerns is that firms may be just kind of getting their managerial act together, quite generally, and that if we just said, are you using data, that could actually mean we're having regular meetings and we're firing underperforming workers and we're providing good incentives, and that's not actually about data. So we're trying to measure these separately, and we use more of the questions on the survey to do that. But more structured management in general, and also having kind of a higher capital stock in the first place for more capital-intensive manufacturing, and being part of a larger distributed firm also tends to predict this, particularly if there's more units in the firm. So it looks like the bigger, more investment-heavy firms are more likely to do this in the first place. So then the question is are they getting something out of this? Is there a there there? There's a lot of hype around this. Maybe they've got some spare cash and they're putting it into this practice, or it sounds like a good thing to say, but is it actually providing any benefits to the firms that do this? And to be clear, the firms that aren't doing it may not be doing it for very good reasons, but conditional on choosing this practice, are they getting something out of it? So as an economist, I've got to give you my long equation with all the Greek letters, but this is sort of a very complicated way of saying we're going to use the wealth of census data to very carefully measure the outputs at the firm. So we're going to look at the sales, and then we're going to control for other things so we can kind of get not just at how much they're selling, but how efficiently are they doing it. So we're going to control for a lot of inputs in terms of their energy expenditure, their capital stock, their labor wage bill, and things like that. We want to separate out what the effect of IT is, because one of our chief concerns is that increasingly what firms are paying for IT and what they're getting out of their IT assets could be very, very different. And we want to start to, we think for the first time, really disentangle these practices from the investment. And we're concerned this is an increasingly important thing to do as firms move more towards software as a service and cloud computing and all these other things that create this wedge between the dollar spend on IT and what you're able to do with it in firms. But so we control for the accumulated IT capital in the firm in terms of both hardware and software. We control for the other structured management practices that are in place. We put in a whole bunch of other time-varying establishment controls. And then using the structure of the survey, we're also trying to difference out things that will be hard to see about these plants that could impact performance. And by putting controls for those in our regression, we're able to really start to hone down in on the data-driven decision-making, which is the delta coefficient there. So when we put this in a fixed effects regression, unsurprisingly, since I'm standing here on a stage showing you some results, we found something there. It's not too exciting to get up and say, well, you know, nothing there. What was interesting, I think, for us right off the bat was that this is the data-driven decision-making practice seems to stand up importantly by itself against the IT investment in the structured management. There's something special about using data-driven decision-making in the firm. And importantly, it's a big effect. So if you were to look at this effect of data-driven decision-making giving you a few percentage point improvement, it's on the order of being at the very top of the IT capital distribution. So being one of the very top firms in IT intensity is the same effect as actually just using what you've got well. And that's sort of shocking. It was sort of shocking to us. The other thing that we did is to go in and try to understand some of the other things that it could be doing and for what types of firms it could be doing it. So we split out the population by smaller single unit firms and these larger multi-unit ones. And what's very interesting here is that most of this effect is loading on the smaller establishments, which made us stop and scratch our head until we realized that there's a timing effect here. And the firms that are larger and more multi-unit went first, and it's the smaller ones that came second. And you can kind of see this in this chart, which is not a performance chart, but it's showing you the effect of the data-driven decision-making over time. And you're seeing that the blue ones are the ones that got it first, and data-driven decision-making is looking good early. And the orange ones are the ones that got it later. And you can see it doesn't start to have an effect until it could potentially have an effect, which is nice in terms of thinking about causation and also thinking about who goes first, what they get from it. And you can see they start to converge. And we don't have direct evidence on this, but we're wondering if the frontier of practice is just continuing to move over time. And we're sort of picking up like the first stage of doing this, and then the competitive reality is that you're going to have to keep moving forward. So the other question we had is, what's going to, conditional on doing this, what's going to make this more effective for firms? And unsurprisingly, if you're combining data-driven decision-making with a good amount of IT investment, that seems to be where a lot of the action is. If you're combining it with an educated workforce who knows what to do with the data, good. That's where most of the benefit is. And then we got a surprise that historically there's been a very interesting relationship between IT and delegation in firms. That if you have information flowing through the firm, you can empower frontline workers to make decisions in firms. It turns out maybe that's not so great in this context, that if we get a nice result for delegation until we look at firms, or a nice result for data-driven decision-making until we look at firms that were very, very delegated, where the plant had a lot of authority over a range of decision-making in the firm, it seems to wipe out entirely the benefits. Now, we're cautious about saying that this means centralization is always better, because our questions ask about centralization and collaboration. And it looks like the thing to do is to have some involvement of headquarters in decision-making, but you don't necessarily want to just wing over to the other side and take away all the decision-making authority at the local establishment. So, what we've done here is leverage this very new, rich source of data and a lot of other things, because it turns out all the other things need to be controlled for in order for us to pin down the effect that we care about. That we can separately account for the IT and the structured management, and that we can do some interesting econometrics with the structure of the survey. And feel pretty confident that we're seeing a relatively big, but not too crazy association of data-driven decision-making with performance. It's not purely causal in the way that the finest economics studies like to have it, because we don't have a natural experiment, but we have a lot of things with the timing that are consistent with this running from data-driven decision-making to performance, and we can see some very interesting interaction effects in firms, which is definitely new to the literature. We find that this is big, statistically and economically. We've got some other results if you want to talk to us about the paper about adjustment costs and what kinds of environments this shows up with. And we're really excited about what's coming next, because this is actually just the first step in a much bigger line of questioning and investigation. And in particular, the 2015 MOPS is coming out, where we got to write some more questions on what types of decisions are powered by data, if we can get some distinctions in terms of the quality of the data. Are they doing controlled experiments or A/B testing? Who gets to decide what data is collected? And so we're going to start to unpack some of the important variations in what types of data-driven decision-making and what types of data are actually being used in firms. And that's all I've got. Thanks very much.
So I think we have time for one or two questions. If anyone has a quick question about data-driven decision-making.
Need more data on it?
Yeah.
Hierarchy piece that you found there?
Yeah, so this is really new. In fact, I told Eric if I had time, there's a couple of new things we're still grappling with understanding. And one of them is the allocation decision making. So there's two things that happen. One is that firms that are a little bit more centralized, maybe not completely, but they have headquarters involved, are more likely to adopt early. So they go first. And then the ones that are later have a little bit more delegation. But if they're really delegated, so if the local establishment is making decisions about hiring, about raises, about new product introduction, about pricing, and advertising, this seems to be kind of not working out for them in the time period that we can observe. Now, an open question is whether, did they make a mistake? Did they overinvest? Or is the adjustment cost of doing this in a decentralized environment just making this slow to show up as productivity? And we can't answer that until we have a longer time series of performance after the adoption event.
Is that also about all employees having access to that same data set, or is it more?
No, so unfortunately we're not seeing a lot about the employees within the plant. It's more about the plant vis-a-vis headquarters. And so it's about more of the firm hierarchy than the employee hierarchy within a particular location. The other thing I meant to mention is that in all this talk about, about artificial intelligence and our new machine overlords coming and taking away all our jobs, an open question for us was whether using data-driven decision-making was helping firms be more efficient at the cost of employees. Are they doing more with fewer people and laying them off? And this morning, we were in the lab looking at the data, and it looks, interestingly, that the data-driven decision-making is not only helping firms during this recessionary period keep their sales up, but it's also helping them keep up their employees in terms of the headcount and the wage bill. So this is not coming at the expense of workers, which is kind of new and interesting.
I wonder if we can equate to be a well-managed company or a well-managed department to having well-defined processes and that you're measuring the right things, if there is a level of distribution where the company is quote-unquote out of control. By that I mean they don't have good processes, they're not measuring. And I'm wondering if that's some of what you're picking up in your data, that the firm is not well managed.
That's why we try to separately control for the management practices, because there's a worry that there's some very badly managed plants out there and that everything is sort of a mess. And we control for the use of what some people would call better management, others a little more cautiously would call structured management. It's a more of a kind of a standardized approach. It's potentially a better fit for our context too. Remember, we're looking in manufacturing where things tend to be quite visible, where standardization is a benefit, where you don't want high variance as opposed to a more creative endeavor where variance is good. Getting it locked down under control is a better thing in manufacturing.
I wonder if in something as operational as management, being too distributed is not that great, whereas maybe in something like innovation, that's wonderful.
Right. And we would love to see that. One of the things we pushed hard to get onto the next census survey is to ask more about innovation at the plant. So many firms have dedicated R&D facilities, but we know there's a lot of very interesting innovation that happens at the plant level, and if we can start to pick up some of that innovative activity, we might see whether data-driven decision-making kind of facilitates or harms that type of endeavor. So we're looking for that in the next round. Thanks so much.